What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my 5 favorite playthroughs from Baldur's Gate 3. A game I haven't talked about in a little bit, as I ultimately wound up playing through the game 12 different times, including Honor Mode, made many videos on it, and after those playthroughs, and hundreds of hours of game time that naturally came along with that, I needed a little bit of a break, but with patch 6 dropping just a bit later next week, I thought it might be time to dip my toes back in that water a little bit, and talk about what I enjoyed most in terms of playing through this game with regard to specific characters or approaches, as this is one of those games I have truly played backwards and forwards, once with every origin character, several times with the Dark Urge, Honor Mode, a solo Tactician run, a Jack-of-all-trades run, and a few other less specific approaches. Among all those playthroughs, there were certainly a few standouts that I wanted to go over here. Now, I will say the first 4 we're going to talk about didn't exactly have a particular order involved, but the last entry we'll get to, the number 1 spot, is, in fact, my most enjoyed playthrough. So starting from the bottom and working our way up, we first have the absurd playthrough, or the jack-of-all-trades approach. That is to say, 1 level in every class as you go, which is necessary for an achievement, but you can actually do that a much easier way simply by picking up a hireling and giving them 1 level in every class. That's pretty boring, so a much more fun thing you can do is play through the entire game that way, which is actually how I chose to live stream the game. And I don't stream much, but I knew Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games a lot of people were going to want to see me play. But what I enjoyed most about this playthrough was simply how very unique the approach is, because it becomes less about making some ultra-optimized build for one purpose or another, but rather just trying to pick and choose what class you want to pick up when to give you the best abilities possible. And it turns out that this is, I would say, a little easier than you would expect, both because of the way the mini classes interact with each other, but also because of how Baldur's Gate 3 is balanced. And while I myself had the first few levels planned out, which actually turned out to be very effective, I didn't really have too much planned beyond, I think it was like level 3 or 4, so after that I was kind of just playing it by ear, so to speak. But I would say the most interesting challenge of that particular run was simply trying to find ways to make sure that character wasn't a complete dead weight, which in some ways was easier than I expected and in other ways harder. But one thing's for sure, it was certainly a very memorable playthrough, which does bring us to our next entry, which was in fact my run with Astarion. As I mentioned, I have played through the game with every single origin character as the avatar character, and of those I actually wound up enjoying Astarion's the most, despite me not actually caring much for him as a character, which I understand is blasphemy to certain parts of the internet, but generally speaking I actually find Astarion very annoying and very off-putting, frankly. However, the reason I liked playing through the game as him is because I think his origin story in particular has the most weight when you're playing with him as a character. For starters, several of his scenes play out a little differently, such as his bite scene in the Act 1 area. And then at the end of the game, his confrontation with Cazador has a lot more narrative weight to it when you're the character who has to make that decision. And it gave me an understanding and appreciation for his character, even if I don't really like him to this day. And while I generally enjoyed playing as the origin characters, I think Astarion's story in particular is really the only one better served by it actually being your character doing it, as opposed to the others being generally just the experience but a slight twist. Which brings me to the third entry, which was actually my solo Tactician run, and this one is up here for pretty much obvious reasons. Playing through as a solo character can be pretty challenging, mostly because you have to find unique and interesting ways to get around problems. And while overall I would say this wound up being easier than I expected, that's largely down to me having played through the game extensively already. But what I especially enjoyed about this was twofold. It was taking a build and really maximizing its effectiveness by abusing mechanics generally, such as the way stealth works when you are just a single character, in particular the invisibility aspect of it, and how you can sort of force enemies to drop you out of combat, which can reset certain combat abilities that you can then take advantage of. And that's on top of finding creative ways to work your way around actually needing to rest, which can see you stacking buffs from various places that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily stack together. And it gave me an appreciation for an approach to the game that I would say is very unorthodox, but still possible because of the many ways you can tackle any individual scenario. But it's definitely one of those playthroughs that got me to think outside the box and as such was a very memorable experience. But speaking of memorable, while I wouldn't consider it my favorite, arguably the most memorable playthrough I had was the last one, which was my honor mode playthrough. And the reason it was so memorable is simply due to the fact that you have the one save file to play around with, which means things that would typically not really matter much because you could force a reload if you really wanted to, such as failing a particularly clutch roll, is suddenly no longer an option. And in particular, I actually made a mistake towards the end of the run that cost me one of my party members that had received some permanent buffs and bonuses that could not be replaced, that is to say Lae'zel, who was at that point a very crucial party member that I was relying on for the rest of the game, only to then lose them very unexpectedly to a Dark Urge roll that I wasn't expecting to have to make because I messed something up. And that critical loss of a party member then led to an Act 3 where I was basically just trying to avoid death at every turn possible while also make up for that very significant loss. And that's just one example of many where the added weight of just not having a million save files to pull from can really add to the experience. Which is great because I found that the legendary actions also added by this mode weren't particularly over the top or exciting, though it is my understanding they're going to be adding some more, so we'll see how it pans out. But by far my most memorable playthrough because of all that tension and everything was the honor mode run. That does, however, bring us to the number one spot, which was my favorite playthrough of all, which is perhaps unsurprisingly my first playthrough. My first playthrough was actually a little bit earlier than most, as I had a review copy of the game ahead of time and was able to put out a review for the launch embargo, and in fact I believe I might have legitimately been one of the first people to beat this game, period, because unlike every other reviewer who only had a review in progress at launch due to the length of the game, I was actually able to finish it. But in any event, experiencing this game for the first time, having rolled the credits on it, I literally jumped out of my chair in excitement at having beaten this and then having to go on to make a review that very same night so I could meet the embargo in the morning was just a very cathartic experience. And I will say, when your first instinct after playing a game of this size is to basically prepare for what's next and continue to play it more, in my case 11 more times, I think it's obvious they're onto something special there. But the reason this playthrough was my favorite is because I was forced to go into it blind, as is usually the case with review copies, but in this instance, being able to create the character I wanted to play as, which was my very original Tiefling Warlock, I'm sure you've never heard of that before, while also making the decisions I would make for myself as opposed to making decisions to see certain outcomes like I did with many of the later playthroughs, was really special. And while I don't think it was a particularly optimized run compared to my later stuff, it was definitely my favorite playthrough just because of the approach and making the decisions I wanted to make and enjoying all the story and options on offer from Larian Studios. But that ultimately has been my 5 favorite playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3, so I certainly hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed playing this game. If you did, do let me know down in the comments section below all about it, any particular favorite moments from your playthroughs, which does of course mean to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.